Yakashugi Temple.
It's by Avery, Savannah, myself, Maddie, and Ginny.
The origin was founded by Siddhartha Gautama. It's also known as the Buddha or the Enlightened One. It stemmed off religions such as Hinduism and Judaism. It began in the Kosala realm in ancient India, modern-day Nepal.
It started in the 5th and 6th century. It is currently practiced in Thailand, Tibet, Taiwan, and Cambodia. Buddhism had many peaks in popularity. It really depended on the leader. For example, we have the Emperor Asoka, who was the main leader in the Maurya dynasty. He witnessed a brutal, extremely brutal war, and he decided to convert to Buddhism for the non-violent practices. So he sent out priests and missionaries to spread the word.
So missionaries and traders had played an important role in spreading Buddhism, and they would carry and share Buddhism beyond India to places like Sri Lanka, and it was also being brought to places more southeast to trading routes and followed the Silk Roads, which were the Central Asian trading routes. And later on, it became one of the most widespread religions of East Asia.
When the Buddha died, a man named Mahadeva turned against the saints by saying the Aryans, people who reached enlightenment, weren't necessarily enlightened ones anymore. His 5 shortcomings that he described were seminal emissions during sleep, nightmares, doubt, ignorance, and they owed their guidance to other people. He created, his ideas created the Mahayana Buddhist. It's another form of Buddhism from the Thyadeva. The extremists in the past were Mahadeva, which, as you can see, he was an extremist that he decided to change the religion, and Ashin Worthu, which was a Burmese Buddhist monk. He was a communal leader of an anti-Muslim movement in Myanmar, and he died in 1968. Extremist in the present, the Bodhubala Sena, which literally means Buddhist power force, was formed by Buddhist monks in 2012. It was accused of anti-Muslim riots, which killed 4 and 80 were injured. Also, the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists, they had over 200 attacks against Christian churches. In 2003 and 2004, they feared that their country's Buddhist hegemony was being challenged by Christian politism.
So we chose the Yakashugi Temple not because of the current place it takes in Buddhist practices, but because of the rich history. So it plays an important role in the past and the present. We started with the roof because there's a lot of detail since they were all fine craftsmen. And then we have a video.
The story of the Buddha's life, like all of Buddhism, is a story about confronting suffering. He was born sometime between the 6th and 4th century BC, the son of a wealthy king in the Himalayan foothills of Nepal. It was prophesied that the young Buddha, then called Siddhartha Gautama, would either become the emperor of India or a very holy man. Since Siddhartha's father desperately wanted him to become the former, he kept the child isolated in a palace. Young Gautama had every imaginable luxury: jewels, servants, lotus ponds, even beautiful dancing women. For 29 years, Gautama lived in bliss, protected from the smallest misfortunes of the outside world. But then he left the palace for short excursions. What he saw amazed him. First he met a sick man, then an aging man, and then a dying man. He was astounded to discover that these unfortunate people represented normal, indeed inevitable parts of the human condition that would one day touch him too. Horrified and fascinated, Gautama made a fourth trip outside the palace walls and encountered a holy man who'd learned to seek spiritual life in the midst of the vastness of human suffering. Inspired by the holy man, Gautama left the palace for good. He tried to learn from other holy men. He almost starved himself to death by avoiding all physical comforts and pleasures, as they did. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it didn't bring him solace from suffering. Then he thought of a moment when he was a small boy. Sitting by the river, he'd noticed that when the grass was cut, the insects and their eggs were trampled and destroyed. As a child, he'd felt a deep compassion for the tiny insects. Reflecting on his childhood compassion, Gautama felt a profound sense of peace. He ate, meditated, and finally reached the highest state of enlightenment, nirvana. It refers to the blowing out of the flames of desire. With this, Gautama had become the Buddha, the awakened one. The Buddha awoke by recognizing that all of creation, from distraught ants to dying human beings, is unified by suffering. Recognizing this, the Buddha discovered how to best approach suffering. First, one shouldn't bathe in luxury, nor abstain from food and comforts altogether. Instead, one ought to live in moderation. The Buddha called this the middle way. This allows for maximal concentration on cultivating compassion for others and seeking enlightenment. Next, the Buddha described a path transcending suffering called the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is the realization that first prompted the Buddha's journey, that there is suffering and constant dissatisfaction in the world. The second is that this suffering is caused by our desires. As the Buddha said, attachment is the root of all suffering. The third truth is that we can transcend suffering by removing or managing these desires. The Buddha thus made the remarkable claim that we must change our outlook, not our circumstances. We are unhappy not because we don't have enough money, love, or status, but because we're greedy, vain, and insecure. By reorienting our minds, we can grow to be content. With the correct behavior and what we now term a mindful attitude, we can also become better people. We can invert negative emotions and states of mind, turning ignorance into wisdom, anger into compassion, and greed into generosity. The fourth and final noble truth the Buddha uncovered is that we can learn to move beyond suffering through what he termed the Noble Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path involves a series of aspects of behaving right and wisely. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. What strikes the Western observer is the notion that wisdom is a habit, not merely an intellectual realization. One must exercise one's nobler impulses on a regular basis, as one would train a limb. The moment of understanding is only one part of becoming a better person. After his death, the Buddha's followers collected his sutras, sermons or sayings, into scripture, and developed texts to guide followers in meditation, ethics, and mindful living. The monasteries that had developed during the Buddha's lifetime grew and multiplied throughout China and East Asia. For a time, Buddhism was particularly uncommon in India itself, and only a few quiet groups of yellow-clad monks and nuns roamed the countryside, meditating quietly in nature. But then, in the 3rd century BC, an Indian king named Ashoka grew troubled by the wars he had fought and converted to Buddhism. He sent monks and nuns far and wide to spread the practice. Buddhist spiritual traditions spread across Asia and eventually throughout the world. Buddha's followers divided into two main schools: Theravada Buddhism, which colonized Southeast Asia, and Mahayana Buddhism, which took hold in China and Northeast Asia. Today, there are between 0.5 and 1.5 billion Buddhists in both East and West, following the Buddha's teachings and seeking a more enlightened and compassionate state of mind. Intriguingly, the Buddha's teachings are important regardless of our spiritual identification. Like the Buddha, we're all born into the world not realizing how much suffering it contains, and unable to fully comprehend that misfortune, sickness, and death will come to us too. As we grow older, this reality often feels overwhelming, and we may seek to avoid it altogether. But the Buddha's teachings remind us of the importance of facing suffering directly. We must do our best to liberate ourselves from the grip of our own desires, and recognize that suffering can be viewed as part of our common connection with others, spurring us to compassion and gentleness.
And then there are citations.
Questions, guys? Yes.
You said in the beginning the leader witnessed a brutal war. Do you know the name of that war?
No, I do not. You may not be able to answer this, and that's not your fault because there probably isn't a lot of information on it. But Buddhism is pretty much the teaching of peace, right? Like we must be kind, compassionate, that sort of thing. So why are the Buddhist terrorist groups who believe in that, or supposedly believe in the same thing, like attacking and killing other people, which pretty much goes against like what Buddhism is saying? Because they completely disagree with other religions, and they don't believe they should exist at all.
So in the very beginning, this was stated as a religion, and then later in the video, it was stated as a philosophy. Those are two contradictory things. So, which one is it?
I think it depends on what kind of Buddhist they are. Again, there are two types.
I will follow.
How serious they are about their religion, how serious they are about reaching enlightenment.
Okay. So there was, as you said, there's two different types. What's the difference between the two types of Buddhism?
Well, Mahadeva didn't believe that the enlightened people were actually the number one enlightened people to follow. So there were different priests and people they could go to if they had problems for the Mahayanan, and that the Hadeva group was basically that the Aryans were the people who reached enlightenment, and they were the number one people.
When you were talking about the extremists, the present-day extremists, you said something about the Buddhist hegemony. What's that?
We were talking about feared that their country's Buddhist hegemony was like their country was number one for Buddhism. That was the religion to go by for their country, and that if the different countries went against their Buddhist beliefs, that they just didn't agree with them.
Nirvana was mentioned in the video, but it wasn't talked about. What is it?
Nirvana is like absolute bliss and peace with oneself, basically.
How do you reach Nirvana, as it says?
As they say, for reaching Nirvana, it's absolute peace in one's mind. There is no real way to reach Nirvana, as different people have reached it in different ways. So.
It's focusing on yourself. They can guide you, but it's a self journey. It's not focused on a god or anything like that.
It's mainly like letting go of things such as like greed and your insecurities, and that's supposedly how you reach nirvana.
So it all depends on the own person's self.
How is Buddhism? How does Buddhists today, when you look at the Buddhist religion, how is it? Let me see so you can figure out what I'm talking about. Depending on if you're Theravada or if you're Mahayana, it's a religion or it's a philosophy. How is this reconciled with other religions for Buddhists?
How does it reconcile with other religions? Well, I think that Buddhists, they're really focused on peace, and I don't know, how do you explain it?
Okay, let me put it this way then.
Yeah, well, you put it in different words.
Yes. Okay. Can you be a Christian and be a Buddhist?
I don't believe so.
Can you be a Buddhist and be a Christian?
Possibly, because they don't believe in a God. They are finding themselves and their best version of themselves.
Okay. So, Buddhist, and then which version? Theravada or Mahayana would that be?
That would most likely be Mahayana. Theravada?
Yeah, you're right. I'm trying to remember my letters. Yes, you're right. It is Mahayana.
Because the Mahayana are mainly based on themselves, and the Theravada was more of reaching enlightenment and being the enlightened one, trying to reach that.
Okay. Any other questions? questions, guys? Questions?
No, but just to draw back to, I think what you guys were saying earlier, just thinking about how the geography and the religion kind of ties together. Where is Buddhism essentially centered? Like, where's home base?
Go back to the mapping map.
Okay, good.
It's
What? Yeah, go ahead.
It's basically Eastern Asia, of like Southeastern Asia. So Thailand and Tibet, and there are places in China and Japan that still use it, and Korea, but there are still people that use it, but they're mainly Christian now.
Okay, so that's kind of what I was going. So the Christians are moving in.
Right.
Who else is moving in?
And they're Christian. There are more Judaism in there now because it comes from Judaism.
And then there's also Arabic coming in.
Islam
Yeah,
is moving in
Islamicism.
very aggressively as well. So you were asking the question about the Buddhist hegemony is how I say that word. Who knows? But the what y'all were calling the hegemony. So basically, you've had a religion or a philosophy there for a very long time. Now all of a sudden, these other religions are becoming powerful in that region, and so the power that has been there is being threatened by new outside whatever.
Mhm.
So yeah, and that's plus. Think about like just world events. Is that area right now a stable place?
I wouldn't say so.
No, I wouldn't say so myself, but it
Does it
depends.
depend on where you're looking at as to whether it's stable or not?
Yes.
So you've got, there's a lot going on there. India has nukes, Pakistan has nukes, and they hate each other. China has nukes. You've got North Korea on your map right there. There's a lot going on politically, religiously. There's a lot. Okay, you go ahead with your question.
Can you go back to the very first slide, I think it was?
With the information. This one.
Is standoff such religions such as Hinduism and Judaism? How did that occur?
We currently do not know, as there is not much information
It's
on.
not Judaism, it's Jainism. You got the wrong word in there.
Because there's a thing called Confucianism in China that it also spurred off of. So I was wondering how they all connected together, or if they did at all.
I think they were currently. I read somewhere that his family was Hindu, and when he left, he kind of also left Hinduism, but he took some of it with him.
And guys, when we actually start learning about Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, all these other Eastern religions, we will see the relationship, and we'll see how all religions are related, even Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, all together. I'll show you the relationships and how they're similar, Islam included. Okay.
Good job.